Maverick meets Rosemary's Baby in Cyrano. Roy Huggins and William Castle could not have been less alike. Bill was bearish and rumpled, with a big grin and a cigar to match. He was warm, voluble, and impulsive. Roy was trim, tanned, and meticulous in dress and manner, an academic who I thought secretly fancied himself a politician or a professor. Roy created Maverick and The Fugitive, and so ensured his posterity. Bill produced suspense movies, some with gimmicks like Smell-O-Vision, but his major claim to fame was the film he made with Roman Polanski, Rosemary's Baby. I was assigned as Roy's assistant at Universal, where he had made a deal to supervise the new anthology Craft Suspense Theater with Perry Como's company and NBC. The imaginative fine print of his contract allowed him to work part-time while pursuing his Ph.D. in political science at UCLA. That's why they needed someone to backstop him and help run the show in his absence. For a while, it was me, then Joe Swirling Jr., then Joe alone. As for Roy, either he couldn't stay away, or he found academia less to his liking. He was on the scene more and more frequently. Deborah and I became quite friendly with one of Roy's editorial assistants, Judy Barrows, and her writer husband, Bob. Talent ran in the family. Judy's sister wrote the pop hit Wendy. When I produced the bold ones, Doctors, I made an unprecedented deal with the Writers Guild to have Judy and Bob write serialized personal vignettes for each of the doctor characters, which we integrated into various episodes. Unfortunately, the series didn't last long enough after that for us to find out if the concepts could work. Sometimes the efforts to digress from the dramatic through line of a show to explore the principal characters' personal lives hadn't proved very effective. Years ago, a good show, Bronx, which starred Jack Palance as a police detective, tried to introduce a reoccurring storyline involving his wheelchair-bound daughter and their home life. It didn't make it. St. Elsewhere and Hill Street Blues did. More recently, personal stories have been closely and successfully woven into the fabric of the main plot: ER, West Wing, Boston Public, Third Watch, NYPD Blue, and notably, The Sopranos. 6 Feet Under is in a class by itself. Judy Barrows' personal story was as dramatic as anything she ever wrote. She and Bob sold their first screenplay and immediately moved to Cuba, New Mexico, where they bought a small ranch, which we visited once, and where they seemed supremely happy. Bob and I went riding while we were there, and from a hilltop, he pointed as far as the eye could see and said, "That's all ours." Occasionally, reluctantly, they came back to L.A. on business. Judy had a long-standing and extremely devoted relationship with her father, and perhaps some unfinished business when he died. One day, she and Bob were able to pitch one of their screenplays to director Martin Ritt, who was very taken with it. Judy called us that night and told us how much Ritt reminded her of her father. We had a dinner date, which she canceled, and the next thing we knew, she'd driven alone to the cemetery where her father was buried, parked close to his grave, and killed herself. No one could believe it, and it took some time for us to accept it. It brought to mind another friend, Brett Spencer, the son of one of my dad's government colleagues, whom I knew in Virginia and later in California. He had obvious issues with his tyrannical father, and one day, Brett shot his own reflection in a mirror, then shot himself. Which takes us back, somewhat elliptically, to Roy Huggins, whom a lot of writers wanted to shoot at one time or another. He had a system for developing stories that was famous. Some might say infamous. He'd come up with an idea, dictate several successive versions of it to Judy or some other assistant, who'd type everything up and file it. PCs weren't in use yet. Then Roy would select a writer, invite him or her in, set up his tape recorder, and dictate the story again, polishing and refining as he went along. Roy once showed me that his fountain pen was a miniature recorder. Writers knew that Roy would probably take a story credit and put his name on the stories. Actually, he used his sons' names, with some justification. Since for the most part, He originated them. There was frequently little room for freelance writers' input, although they sometimes contributed enough material to share the story credit. Many producers, me included, came up with stories or story ideas and simply gave them to writers we wanted to work with. No strings attached. That may have been unduly generous, but we felt it was part of the job description. When I worked with him, I sat in on one of Roy Huggins' story meetings. Once an older, credentialed writer was called in, who'd heard about Roy's routine. To avoid any confusion or misunderstanding, he brought his own tape recorder and set it on the coffee table opposite Roy's. I thought Roy was a little perturbed at the one-upmanship. A producer-director who worked on craft suspense theater with Roy and me was Robert Altman, not yet a successful feature filmmaker. He and Roy were not exactly compatible. One of the areas of their contention was post-production, particularly editing. Bob was a creative force in his own right. Roy liked to play around with the footage. To protect his work, Bob camera cut as much as possible. Roy was angry and frustrated to not be given any choices. When he wanted to make a deletion in one scene in particular, and there was nothing to cut away to, he asked the editor to find a stock library shot of an owl in a tree and cut away to that. Afterwards, if a cutaway was needed in anyone's film anywhere in the Universal lot, the editor was simply told to cut to the owl. I worked with the affable Bill Castle on an anthology series called Ghost Story, Circle of Fear, which was hosted by Sebastian Cabot. It attempted suspenseful contemporary scripts rather than period pieces in the English moors, and it attracted major guest stars. To that end, additional money was provided. The top of the show was $15,000. For Melvin Douglas, Gina Rowlands, Patricia Neal, Helen Hayes, Martin Sheen, Karen Black, Stuart Whitman, Janet Leigh, Hal Linden, Rip Torn, Angie Dickinson, Jason Robards, and others. The scripts were generally good, but the performances were always terrific. Thanks in part to stellar directors like Richard Donner, David Lowell Rich, Leo Penn, Sean's father, Emmy Award winner for MASH, Charles Dubin, and Paul Stanley. Before they were famous, many actors, Robert Duvall, William Shatner, Charles Bronson, worked on The Virginian and craft suspense theater for a lot less money, a lot less. Raquel Welch played a saloon girl in a Virginian episode, with one line. A special guest star on the craft show was Ronald Reagan, who politely insisted that I bring Roy Huggins down to the set so they could discuss an item in the script with which he disagreed politically about capital punishment, I think. That was before he became governor or president, but the telltale signs were already there. Lew Wasserman had been Reagan's agent at MCA, and when his film career started to wane, Lew made a deal for him to host Death Valley Days and GE Theater on TV. As spokesman for GE, Reagan toured the country, making speeches and establishing a considerable grassroots identity, which later served him well with voters. The rumor was that Reagan had been a Democrat before he married Nancy. Then his new father-in-law converted him. Ardent Democrat and industry statesman Lew Wasserman thought he could help Reagan become president. As usual, Lew had the right idea. It wasn't his fault Reagan wound up in the wrong party. Some of the stories for Ghost Story were purchased from published material. The rest Bill and I and the two story editors, Mark Weingart and Jimmy Stangster, originated. Bill was wonderful at strolling in with the fragrant, kicking it around, nursing it along, fleshing it out, and then assigning it. Unlike Roy Huggins, Bill did very little actual writing, but he had a great instinct. One day, on our way to a network meeting, we passed some men digging a trench near a sign that said, "Men Working." The familiar routine began. "What if one of those guys digs something up?" I said. "A box," Bill said immediately. "What's in it?" "He wants to find out, but he can't get it open. And he takes it home, and he stashes it in the garage. And he gets more and more preoccupied with it, with what's in it. And he starts slacking off at work. And his wife is upset, and the marriage suffers until she herself gets hooked. Right, but no matter how they try, they can't budge it. Until they finally open it. And inside is..." We pitched it to the committee at the network, just like that. They were intrigued and wanted to know what was in the box, but we didn't tell them, because we didn't know yet. On the way back to the office, we figured out the rest of the story. The box had a miniature carousel horse in it, which was fine until it began to grow to a huge, terrifying proportions, and the young couple knew they had to get it back into the box, but had no idea how. The whole story took about 15 minutes each way for us to develop. Martin Sheen and Kim Darby starred in the show, and it holds up pretty well, even today. The small carousel horse is upstairs on a bookshelf, not growing, I hope. Another script had a grandmother visiting who was unknown to her family, a murderous witch. We simply couldn't cast the part, but at the last minute, we changed a few descriptive lines and sent the script to Melvin Douglas, who made a distinguished and fearful warlock. The child who played his granddaughter was Jodie Foster. One episode was based on an idea of sci-fi and fantasy writer Harlan Ellison, who's gifted and unpredictable. It was about a bunch of artisans who share a loft and gradually disappear, becoming their art. I hired a young sculptor I knew for a day. He had no idea how to charge by the hour, but we figured something out. Took him to the metal shop in the back lot with a sketch my artist friend Jerry Gebler made, and watched, fascinated, while the studio sheet metal worker and the sculptor collaborated on a shiny, stylized being, a life-sized original work of art. The result was stunning, and long after production of the show, I spotted it in a commercial studio prop room one day, and my wonderful friend Danny Dayton, then a VP of the company, helped me cram it into the back of my station wagon, no questions asked. I was able to steal the statue and put it in my backyard where it stands today, a grotesque, metallic, headless figure. My kids love it. They call it Eduardo. I have to acknowledge my debt to Bill Blinn, whom I worked with on a short-lived series called Bridges to Cross, starring Suzanne Pleshette, Nick Sororvi, Ava Gabor, and Jesse Ferrer. We struggled with the show, but the worked with couldn't have been better. I actually got to see Cyrano. Jose gave an Oscar-winning performance in the movie, and dailies every day, and once embarrassed myself by mentioning it to Jose, who couldn't have cared less and was sick of Cyrano. The cast was friendly and professional, and Bill Blinn, whose many important credits include the original Unforgettable Brian song, is a gentleman of the Ephraim Zimbalist school. Bill and his colleagues, Frank Miller and Chris Beaumont, made the journey eventful, although there were only a few bridges for us to cross. While I'm in an, admittedly out of context, acknowledgement mode, the distinguished senior agent production executive, Ben Benjamin, was kind enough to take a look at one of my early scripts, and executive producers Quinn Martin and Lee Rich were very decent to me. So were network execs Bob Silberling, who became a good friend, Steve Mills, Pat Betts, and Tony Barr. Producer casting exec Renee Valentine practically hand-delivered the stars to me on Ghost Story Circle of Fear. Her femininity and courage were a big plus. Long before that, when I was a Columbia Pictures messenger, Rita O'Connor, who ran the steno pool, encouraged me to come in at lunchtime and practice touch typing. Presumably, that was a prerequisite for moving up a rung to something important, extra casting, where my friend Hare Henshaw worked, importantly typing up vouchers. When he confided to me that everyone there just hunted and pecked like I did, I started eating lunch again. The relationships on a weekly series are intense and can be conflicted. In one case, I developed severe insomnia, which I finally traced in part to tension in the hierarchy of the show I was on. The studio was sensitive to the problems, some of which had to do with shooting on a distant location while the boss was 3 time zones away, and there were several meetings to discuss staffing changes, which up till then had taken place on a revolving door basis. I think at the time I was the 10th producer through that door. I had the distinct impression that if I took some initiative, there was one significant change that might yet be made, but I felt that would be creatively disruptive, and, for a change, I chose discretion rather than valor. When another showrunner spot opened up, I was relieved to take it. Unfortunately, when I viewed the pilot of that series, I found it unintelligible, and I spent most of my tenure struggling to make sense of it. Roy Huggins and Bill Castle are gone now, and Quinn Martin. But clearly, they're not forgotten. They were originals, each with a distinctive spirit and style. It takes that kind of singular personality to develop a movie or manage a TV show, and stamina, guts, and intelligence, and, oh yes, talent.